This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 328 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. If your fantasy teams escaped Week 14 without an injury, then you just naturally gained value in your fantasy football playoffs. There were tons of injuries this week, which means there are things to talk about on today's show. Before getting to those things, though, I wanted to remind you guys about FanDuel's Santa Streak contest. All you have to do is finish in the top 50% of an eligible contest over on FanDuel to build your streak. If you do, great, your streak continues. If you don't, your streak ends and you have to start a new streak the next day. At the end of the contest, you'll be rewarded based on the length of your longest streak. And the user with the longest streak out of everyone will win the grand prize. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Drop Josh Allen. So in Week 14, Josh Allen faced a very tough matchup against the Ravens. And I won't sit back and say that expectations were very high. I did talk about him as a sit on my matchup show last week, but it's not like people were ranking him as a high-end QB1. But to be fair, he was started in a lot of leagues. He was started in 33% of Yahoo leagues. He came through with 10.7 fantasy points, nothing special. And the thing is, we just watched him not do a whole lot in a tough matchup, and over the next 2 weeks, he gets just as tough of matchups. Week 15 features a game against Pittsburgh, and the Steelers are allowing 3.3 fantasy points below expectation to opposing team quarterbacks this year. And then in Week 16, they get New England. No team has been better at stopping quarterbacks than the New England Patriots. And both of those games are on the road. So you have to take a step back and say, could Josh Allen come through with a big performance? Yeah, he could. But after what he did against Baltimore this past week, are you going to feel good putting him in your starting lineup against the Steelers this week? Probably not. So if you hold on to him but you don't start him, that means you're holding on to him just to face New England in Week 16. So to me, logically, Josh Allen can be dropped. Add A.J. Brown. So I talked about A.J. Brown on this show maybe a couple weeks ago, and he should be added, especially after what he did this past weekend. Since Ryan Tannehill took over this Titans offense in Week 7, only 5 teams have averaged more yards per drive, and only the Ravens have scored touchdowns at a higher rate per drive. Ryan Tannehill has completely transformed this offense, and that's allowed players that are not named Derrick Henry to be fantasy relevant. Since Tannehill's takeover, A.J. Brown has averaged a 22% target share and 14.4 PPR points per game. And over the next 2 weeks, he gets decent matchups against the Texans and Saints. Hold or add Ryan Fitzpatrick. So I liked Ryan Fitzpatrick in Week 14. He came through with a very mediocre performance. Now, to be fair, he did lose his top receiver, Devontae Parker, in that game to a concussion. He didn't have very good options to throw to. But assuming Parker can get back for Week 15, I think that Fitzpatrick could continue to be a relevant quarterback streamer. Because the Dolphins get a plus matchup against the Giants this week. And then they finish out the fantasy football season with a game against Cincinnati. Those are 2 plus matchups for opposing quarterbacks. So even if Devontae Parker can't come back, I don't think Ryan Fitzpatrick's an awful streamer. I just would have a lot more confidence if Parker were playing. Add DeAndre Washington. So Josh Jacobs ended up being a true game time decision on Sunday, and as we all know, he didn't play. So instead, we saw DeAndre Washington. We saw a lot of DeAndre Washington. He played 63.5% of Oakland's offensive snaps, and he had amazing market share numbers. He had 63.6% of the team's running back rushes and a 23% target share. Those numbers are better than what Josh Jacobs typically sees. In fact, Josh Jacobs never had that high of a target share in a single game this year. So if Josh Jacobs misses more time, DeAndre Washington should be in store for good fantasy production. Sell the New York Jets offense. Now let's be honest, the Jets offense hasn't been unbelievable from a fantasy perspective over the last month and a half, but they haven't been awful. The thing is, though, they've faced the Jags, then the Dolphins, then it was the Giants, then Washington, then Oakland, and then Cincinnati, and then Miami this past weekend. Their schedule has been unbelievably easy, and we know that they haven't been all that fantasy relevant despite that schedule. Now, over the next 2 weeks, they get the Ravens and the Steelers. Sam Darnold can absolutely be dropped, and it would be very, very difficult to start Robbie Anderson or Jamison Crowder. And the same kind of goes for Le'Veon Bell too, but we know that there aren't many choices at the running back position. Drop Brandin Cooks. So the Rams have moved the ball pretty well over the last 2 weeks. But even with this, Brandin Cooks has 4 combined targets for 24 receiving yards. And over the next 2 weeks, the Rams get a below average matchup against Dallas, and then they get an awful matchup against San Francisco. So similar to the Josh Allen logic, take a step back. Ask yourself, are you ever going to play Brandin Cooks? Because you're likely not going to play Brandin Cooks this week after how he's been performing. And then if Cooks has a really big performance against Dallas, are you still going to be confident enough to play him against San Francisco? Probably not. That's why he can be dropped. Buy Phillip Lindsay. I've talked about this quite a bit on this show over the last month or two, but when Joe Flacco went down for the season and Brandon Allen stepped in as quarterback for the Broncos, things changed for this Broncos backfield. In 8 games with Joe Flacco, both Royce Freeman and Phillip Lindsay combined for a 26.4% target share in that offense. When Allen took over, that number dropped to 11.5%. That's a huge drop. But over the last 2 games with Drew Lock, we've seen not only this Broncos offense be more competent, but Lindsay and Freeman have combined for a 21% target share. Now, this hasn't led to huge target totals for fantasy purposes. Both backs have 11 combined targets over the last 2 games. That's not unbelievable. The thing is, though, they've seen positive game scripts in those 2 games. When you're in a positive game script, you're not going to throw the ball as much. Drew Lock hasn't thrown the ball 30 or more times in a single game yet. Because when a team is leading, they're running the ball more. And while that's not a bad thing for a running back, targets are more valuable than attempts at the position. So let's just put this another way. If Denver faces a negative game script, we should expect Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman to a degree to see more volume through the air. And over the next 2 weeks, they get Kansas City and Detroit. They could very easily see a negative game script against Kansas City. And we know that Kansas City can't stop the run either, and neither can Detroit. So they get 2+ matchups for run game purposes. And then on top of that, if they see a negative game script, we know that these running backs are going to be more involved as receivers. So I really like Phillip Lindsay and to a degree Royce Freeman over the next 2 weeks. Add Patrick Laird. Over the last 2 weeks, Patrick Laird has led the Dolphins in backfield snaps. In week 13, his snap share was 59.7%. That led to a top 20 performance. It was 81.9% this past week, and he scored 12.6 PPR points. The Dolphins, as I talked about earlier, get the Giants and Bengals over their next 2 games. Patrick Laird could very easily be fantasy relevant over these 2 contests. Drop Tyrell Williams. So Tyrell Williams started the season off pretty strong. He was averaging almost 16 PPR points per game over the first 4 weeks of the season, and then he got hurt. And since his return in week 8, that number's been cut in half. And he's had just 2 top 40 performances. And his target share has been a pretty average 16% over this time. And it's not like the Raiders have had these really tough matchups over and over again. He's seen easy matchups. He just hasn't come through. And that's why he's a drop candidate. Add Chris Conley. So DJ Chark was seen in a protective boot after the team's week 14 loss. And he also apparently left the locker room using a scooter. He's now week to week to day to day. That's a big deal for the passing attack because he's not only caught 44.4% of the team's passing touchdowns this year, but he has a 23% target share across the season. So if DJ Chark doesn't go, Chris Conley should get more run, or at the very least, he'll have a much higher target floor. And that could be big because over the final 2 weeks of the fantasy season, the Jags get the Raiders and the Falcons. Those are 2 good wide receiver matchups. Sell Tevin Coleman. So I think that you could hypothetically drop Tevin Coleman right now. But the reason I'm not saying to flat out drop him yet is because the San Francisco backfield is really unpredictable. And it's not very easy to just find usable running backs. Although to be fair, Tevin Coleman isn't very usable. But for a second straight week, Coleman was outsnapped, outproduced, and outplayed by Raheem Mostert. Coleman had even bigger problems in week 14 too because Matt Breida returned to action. And Matt Breida played more snaps than Tevin Coleman. So as it stands, this is Raheem Mostert's backfield. But things can change so quickly in this backfield. We know a lot of fantasy points can come from it, but we don't know who's going to score those points. I want Raheem Mostert over any of these backs right now, but things can change very quickly. So if you have space to hold Tevin Coleman, I think he's fine to just hold, but you can't trust him in week 15, which is why he's a sell. But things can change in week 15. Someone could get hurt, or maybe Tevin Coleman gets a little bit of revenge against his old team. So I would hold Tevin Coleman on my team and not use him, which is why he's a sell candidate. Add David Njoku. So it's going to take a lot to use David Njoku in week 15, And the reason I say that is because he wasn't used all that much in his first game back from injury. He played 37.5% of Cleveland snaps on Sunday, and he only ran 9 routes according to Pro Football Focus. So if you're going to have faith in starting David Njoku this week, you're going to have to see reports that say he's going to get more run. That's absolutely necessary to have the confidence to play Njoku. But he is playing the Arizona Cardinals, and the Cardinals have been horrendous against tight ends all season long. So I do think that Njoku is worth an add early in the week because there might be a report that says he's going to play more in week 15. Add Brashad Perriman. So it's not sounding good for Mike Evans. He scored a touchdown on Sunday, and as he was in the end zone, if you guys saw it, he was just holding his hamstring. You know something was wrong with his hamstring. And head coach Bruce Arians, after the game, said that he would be shocked if Evans played again this year. So that opens things up for Brashad Perriman to be the number 2 option at wide receiver for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. Now, as long as Jameis Winston is healthy, he has a thumb injury right now, but as long as he's healthy, I do think Perriman could be a worthwhile sort of desperation play. The Buccaneers have a soft playoff schedule. They have matchups against the Lions and the Texans over the next 2 weeks. And when adjusted for strength of opponent, both of those teams are well above average matchups for opposing wide receivers. Add Mitch Trubisky. Over the last 5 weeks, Mitch Trubisky ranks 5th in fantasy points per game at the quarterback position. That's true. Only Lamar Jackson, Ryan Tannehill, Jameis Winston, and Josh Allen have averaged more fantasy points per game than Mitch Trubisky. He's been a top 10 quarterback in 4 of those 5 games. And best of all, the Bears are letting Mitch Trubisky be Mitch Trubisky. He's not being the game manager like we saw earlier in the season. He's being a little bit more DGAF. He's taking more risks. And as a result, he's averaged 7 rushing attempts per game over his last 3 contests. That's resulted in 28 rushing yards per game and a pair of rushing touchdowns. Now, the matchup against Green Bay this week isn't ideal. I'm not going to sell it as something that's great. But I do think that Trubisky's done enough in fantasy over the last month to warrant a start for those of you who are desperate at the position. Add the Detroit Lions defense. Hopefully you planned ahead for your defensive matchup in the playoffs, but if you didn't, I don't think Detroit's the worst option in the world. They're playing at home, they're 3.5-point favorites, and they're either playing against Jameis Winston with a messed up thumb, or they're playing against a backup quarterback. And this Buccaneers offense won't have Mike Evans. But even if Winston does go, and even if Winston is his normal self, the Bucs are still a plus matchup. They've allowed defenses to score 2.6 more points per game than their season-long averages. That's one of the higher marks in the league. The 16th transaction that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com this week is to hold Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. I know it's been frustrating to have both of these players, especially Tyler Lockett. But keep in mind that the Seahawks have a really juicy matchup in week 16 against the Cardinals. I'm a little afraid of what their volume could look like this week against Carolina because we know that the Panthers are horrible against the run. And the Seahawks would love nothing more than to give Chris Carson the ball 35 times while Russell Wilson throws it 18 times. But I'd expect a big outing from the passing attack in week 16. So don't go dropping Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf. Don't get fully discouraged. They should be startable in week 16. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back tomorrow with a 10 Trends episode.